I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, I am Connor Ruebusch. With me is Patrick Wyman, Dr. Patrick Wyman, in fact, and this is Heavy Hands, the only show where the fists are as heavy as Vasyl Lomachenko's mom. I think what happened here, Pat, is I outsourced some of our intro writing because, I put all that pressure on myself to keep coming up with good ones. This one was submitted by a Miguel M. Do you know who that could be?
Miguel M?
Yeah, maybe.
No,
Oh, maybe it'll come up later. So, welcome to Heavy Hands. I'm Connor Ruebusch. With me is Patrick Wyman. Today we've got quite a few different things to talk about from different sporting arenas. We've got UFC Fight Night, what was it? UFC Fight Night Mexico City, of course, between Sergio Pettis and Brandon Moreno in the main event. Also the co-main event, Mexican strawweight star Alexa Grasso missed weight in her attempt against Ronda Marcos, but still an interesting fight that bears talking about. Then we're going to talk about the fight between Vasyl Lomachenko and Miguel Maraga, who fought on Saturday as well. That was an impressive performance. And then later in the show, we are going to get to some questions from our listeners via the Heavy Bag. Pat, before we get into all of that stuff, though, let's jump in to the UFC card. Sergio Pettis really kind of had his apotheosis here. He ascended to contendership, and then wisely decided he wanted another fight or two before he tried to vie for the title, which I really liked to hear, to be honest. What did you think of his win over Moreno?
I thought that this was Sergio Pettis coming into his own as a fighter, essentially. I think that has been the case for the last couple of fights. After watching this, it made me wonder if maybe his fight with Cejudo that was scheduled to take place at UFC 211 back in May wouldn't have been closer than maybe I thought at the time. Maybe we all kind of thought at the time. I think we all pretty much would have picked Cejudo in that. The version of Sergio Pettis who beat Moreno here was not perfect, but he was increasingly the best version of himself rather than trying to be a fighter that he was not, which is what we've seen from him at various points. Like at various points, Sergio has tried to fight like his brother. He has tried to be a well-rounded mixed martial artist and shot a lot of takedowns and tried to grapple quite a bit. And when he has done those things, he has been less effective. What we saw here was, I think, Sergio figuring out what his style is, what his game is, and figuring out how he's going to make that work against increasingly high-level competition.
Yeah, I think what we saw in past fights, when we've seen Sergio's losses, and for some reason it always feels like there's a lot of bad stuff in Sergio's career. It's just 2 losses in the UFC. It bears remembering he's still very young and still has plenty of time, even now, to keep getting better and become the fighter he's meant to be. But I think what we saw a lot of happening to him in those sort of opportunistic finishes by his opponents were Pettis maybe thinking too much, trying to be creative and stay on his toes and keep the opponent guessing and just do different stuff. And in this fight, when he looked most effective, it was when he was flowing. It did not look like there was a ton of forethought going in. It was feeling and identifying openings as they appeared. I'm sure there's still a good bit of anticipation. Every fighter needs to be able to anticipate, but it's a matter of if that's in the forefront of your mind, that you're anticipating something happening, because then you become cautious and timid and start to wait. Or if it's informing the actions that you are sort of automatically making thanks to your training. And I guess what that speaks to is a lot more just comfort from Sergio Pettis now. The difference between what we saw in this fight, how comfortable Pettis looked, putting his strikes together, being willing to take a shot or get taken down, how calm and composed. He didn't panic at all. He didn't throw any strikes that I can recall and then stand around in front of his opponent. He tried 2 crazy kicks, got taken down on one, and then didn't really try any more. I just thought it was a very composed-looking Sergio Pettis, and I think that's the difference between what we saw here and what we saw maybe a few years ago when he lost to Benoit and Caceres.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the difference, is a guy who is confident in what he brings to the table. I think he's really turning into an exceptional counterpuncher.
Yeah.
That's the thing that's really striking to me. And his brother too is a pretty good counterpuncher, but Anthony's a good counterpuncher in the way that like responses have been drilled into him, and he's pretty fast. Sergio, I think, shows some real brilliance in the way that he puts his counters together, like in terms of the way that he measures the distance, the way that he times them. He's really good at pausing for an awkward half beat before throwing the shot, or stepping off to a small angle to land it. Like he's the kind of counterpuncher who you can tell has been training in these things since he was a teenager. Like he's got a lot of depth of skill to back up his responses. So there's a lot to it. There's a lot of craft to his game. There's a lot of fundamental soundness too that is not necessarily there with his brother. And I think that is, it almost does us a disservice in trying to understand what makes Sergio really good, because he is really good, to compare him to his brother.
Yeah, I think that's inevitable. I do think it can be helpful to make that comparison to just to understand the two of them by looking at the differences from one to the other. For me, I'm sure there was a lot of pressure that Sergio had on himself. And I would not be surprised if that played a factor in how much less comfortable he looked when he first came to the UFC. Seemed like, kind of in the headlights, or the spotlight's on him, and he needs to make the right calls now or it's all over. And you could even tell when he got knocked out by Ryan Benoit, like, nobody likes getting knocked out, of course, but he was extremely frustrated with himself after that. I recall seeing him in the cage and seeing how angry he was, like he wasn't allowed to make a mistake. And now in a 5-round fight against Brandon Moreno, we see Sergio Pettis making mistakes sometimes in a way that seems fine. Like making veteran mistakes, where once he makes them, he's not going to continue making them again, or he's not going to overthink it. He's going to move on, keep the initiative, and keep pressing his game. And I guess if you had to come up with one key difference between Sergio and Anthony, it would probably be that Anthony, as we've often said, I don't want to overplay this, but in very simple terms, Anthony is talent first, skill later. Anthony's trying to learn skill now. You know what I mean? Pretty Tony is trying now to develop his jab, trying now to develop his footwork and his defense. Not that he never had skills. Of course, he's a fighter. He needs to have skills, but he didn't have all the skills in the perfect network that is expected of fighters who are considered fundamentally sound. And for Sergio, it was clearly skills first, technique first. We've been saying since he came to the UFC, he's a lot more technically sound than his brother. He's very fundamental. He's a very sort of straightforward, well put together kickboxer, but it took him getting enough experience and having a few bad experiences to develop the talent of fighting. And I think for him, the talent is initiative, control, and pressure is actually kind of a thing that I have seen from Sergio in a lot of recent fights. I wonder if you've picked up on that as well. I remember the fight with John Maraga in particular. He put a lot of pressure on Maraga, especially at the end of the first round. This was the first time I'd seen him doing it consistently for like 15, 18 minutes in a row and continuing to improve his attacks as he did it. Like, this was a great, aggressive performance that, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
Sergio's discovered himself, and it turns out he kind of likes to beat people up. And that's not something he did before.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on a really good point there. And this is true of both Pettis brothers. Anthony is better when he pressures, and we saw this from him against Jim Miller, right? Like, and I'll tell you exactly why that is. It's because both of them need to have space at their backs. They both need to have room to maneuver if their opponent does something, because even though Sergio is fundamentally sounder than Anthony is, he's still not a real crafty defensive fighter. He can parry, he can occasionally move his head, he can occasionally kind of roll with shots or block them with his gloves. But really, he is not a layered defensive fighter, and he probably never will be. He may, if he manages to stick around at a high level for another 4 or 5 years, maybe he'll develop those kinds of skills, but I wouldn't count on it. Like, Duke Roufus has never trained like a really defensively slick fighter, and I doubt if he's going to have one, it'll be Sergio.
But we see slick moves from Sergio when the opponent's responding to him. Like when he's pressuring and he gives you a feint and you swing back, he can time that and do some pretty cool stuff with it. Yeah,
but that's my whole point, is that he needs to have room to maneuver to do that. And the way to give yourself the most room to maneuver is to take it away from your opponent. It's a zero-sum game where space that your opponent doesn't have, i.e. what you take away from them by pressuring them back towards the fence, gives you all of that room to maneuver to pull things off. It gives you all of this room to pivot. It gives you all of this room to turn and take angles and sidestep and do things so that when your opponent tries to do something back to you as you're pressuring, suddenly you don't have to worry about getting trapped against the fence. You don't really have to worry about being taken down nearly as much because you're going to be the one who's dictating the space,
right,
who's dictating the range, who's dictating the angles. You're going to give yourself room. If they duck under and try to shoot a double, well, you've got room for your hips to sprawl. And you've got room to pivot and turn and take an angle as they try to take you down.
If the opponent feels pressured, you dictate everything, basically. As long as you keep the opponent thinking about what you're going to do next, and then you compound that with the fact you have all this room at your back, the options are basically endless for a fighter with Sergio Pettis's dexterity and agility and variety of skills. He can basically do whatever he wants if he's pressuring. And that's why I'm going to slightly disagree with what you said earlier about Henry Cejudo. I still think that is the crossroads fight for Pettis. I think it may be the fight to make next, or maybe after one more fight for Sergio. And if he can beat Cejudo, I say you throw him at DJ as quickly as possible. And I think the difference is that Cejudo, I assume, will come out in that fight very aggressive and will pressure and will swing bombs at Sergio. And I need to see how he can do if the other guy tries to pressure him. Because we've seen now Sergio at his best when he's pressuring, but Demetrius Johnson's not going to let him pressure. And if he couldn't stop Brandon Moreno's takedowns a couple of times, Demetrius Johnson's going to pressure him and drop him on his butt over and over and over again if he's not flexible enough to get back to his comfort zone when somebody's coming after him. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I understand exactly what you're saying. I think that's a good point. And Cejudo, too, like, this is not to give too much shine to Pettis, I guess, but, like, his takedown defense is still not exceptional. Yeah. And it probably never will be exceptional. And, you know, that's going to be a problem when you're fighting the upper echelons of this division, whether it's the Joseph Benavidez's, if he comes back healthy, Henry Cejudo, Demetrius Johnson. I mean, even Ray Borg would be a tough matchup for Sergio Pettis in that regard, because he's so quick on his takedowns and is probably not going to let Pettis pressure him that way.
Maybe before you give Sergio any of those guys, you give him like a Dustin Ortiz. How does he do against like a more limited but very strong and persistent wrestler? Because that's the big question, I think, is the two big questions are how does he deal with the wrestling? How does he deal with the pressure? Because even though we think of Sergio as a long-range fighter, I think we've seen in these recent fights, especially this one, he likes to be in charge. And I need to see how he does when somebody takes about 10 or 15 minutes of a fight and doesn't let him be in charge, and see if he can get it back.
Yeah, I think Wilson Hayes is probably the right fight for him. I'm not sure if Hayes is booked right now, but I think Hayes is probably the right fight because Borg is booked. Cejudo has lost 2 in a row. I'm not sure you want to put him in there. It's not a bad fight to make. Like, obviously they had just made it, but or Formiga. Like, I think you're fine giving Pettis somebody coming off a loss in order to prove his skills in some particular area.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty is the kid's 23. Like, I shouldn't call him a kid because I'm 26, but like every time anyone's younger than me, I can't possibly be like I need to see what they have to offer now because like he's young, he's extremely young and has plenty of time even now. And it already feels like he's been in the UFC for 2 or 3 years now, but he's still got room and time. So, Sergio Pettis, what about Brandon Moreno? Thoughts on what you saw from him? Does this sort of change how you assess his place in the division now that you've seen him lose pretty clearly, I think, to Brandon Moreno, to Sergio Pettis?
So I think Moreno is incredibly talented and has a really, really long way to go in terms of making all of his skill sets work. Because you see everything from him in flashes, but it's all disconnected. He'll hit an exceptional takedown, he's a wizard on the mat. But like if you want to play a kind of a dangerous grappling game, you really need to be able to consistently get the fight there and hold the fight there. Like that's you really have to have the wrestling game to enforce that. And the various pieces of Moreno's game don't really seem to go together all that well. And it takes him a while to figure out what he's going to do. Like, so a lot of it feels really kind of random and not well thought out, which is something that could change because he's still really young. Like, he's still got a lot of room to grow and get better as a fighter. But right now, he needs to go and be coached for a while. Like, he needs to go and like really spend time with Duane Ludwig, I think, to try and put the various pieces of his striking game together.
So, I mean, his striking was worse in this fight than it was in the last one. I do think that. I know, and I don't know what his training situation was exactly. Was he not with Duane Ludwig and the elevation guys as much for this camp because it was in Mexico? I know he also trains at Entrim.
I think he was only there. I think he was only in Colorado for a few weeks, and hasn't been. And I think they said 5 weeks before the fight he left.
Oh, like that little cell phone going off in the show. Been a while since that happened.
Love it.
I've also got my cat just viciously biting my feet because she wants me to pay attention to her. All's going well. Let's. Here's the thing. Moreno, technically, we could get into the nitty gritty of how he looked worse, how he looked different than the last fight, in which he basically head kick knocked out Dustin Ortiz before submitting him. But the big thing is that he was playing a lot of games. Like, he was doing things that you should do in sparring to figure out how cocky you're allowed to be in a fight. You know what I mean? Like, he was doing some of the stuff that I've seen, like McGregor. Like, okay, well, here's an example. Conor McGregor was sparring Chris Van Heerden. You remember that?
I do.
And the full video came out of Van Heerden actually kind of teaching McGregor a bit of a boxing lesson, not the edited version that McGregor's team released. And there was a time when McGregor did a thing where he held his hands behind his back and he leaned his head forward. He was looking for a pull counter, like Floyd uses. And Van Heerden just hit him in the face. He just tapped him with a jab. And it turns out McGregor did that in sparring and learned, okay, maybe I don't quite have this down yet. Well, Moreno was doing stuff like waving the hands, making faces, doing all these moves, as if he was setting something up, but I don't think he knew what he was setting up, and I don't think he was ready to respond to what the counters to those moves might be. Like, he was doing the arrogant fighter thing, but the secret of the arrogant fighter thing is that you don't do it because you're arrogant. You do it because you're good, because you know exactly how this move works, and there is absolutely no way anyone can surprise you because you only use this move, you only do this taunting or whatever when you have a range, a phase, a position that you like, that you are skilled and comfortable in. And Moreno was doing the arrogant fighter thing here, I think, out of maybe a bit of youthful arrogance, having skyrocketed up the division so quickly after that big upset win in his debut, which was less than a year ago. And now here he is fighting for what was assumed to be possibly a title shot. And I think that's just too much, and we need more time, and Moreno needs to just study the fundamentals of striking more than anything, I think. Striking and wrestling.
You see flashes, right? Yeah. Like, that's the thing, is you see the flashes of his talent, and you saw that in the Alexandre Pantoja fight back on Tough. Like, if you just stand in a phone booth with Moreno, he will bang it out with you and look pretty good doing it.
Oh, yeah.
But he doesn't know how to force that fight. And he knows how to kick reasonably well, but he doesn't know how. And I mean, like, in the sense that he knows how to throw kicks, and they're pretty hard, and they can be effective. But he doesn't really know how to set them up, and he doesn't really know how to dictate a fight at kicking range. So I guess maybe that's it. Is he has skills, but he doesn't know how to dictate the broader context in which those skills can work.
He doesn't understand all the wrinkles of his various skills. Like, he doesn't understand not
just that, but he's not putting himself in position to use them. The things that he's good at, he doesn't really know how to dictate the range or the pace or the kind of broader context that's going to allow his skills to work.
Mm-hmm. And how it fits together.
Yeah, so it doesn't do you any fucking good to be able to bang it out in the pocket if you don't know how to make the fight take place in the pocket. It doesn't do you any good to throw sharp, effective kicks if you don't know how to make sure that your opponent is in kicking range. Mm-hmm. It doesn't do you any good to know how to shoot like a really nice, explosive, pretty clean double if you can't get to a range where shooting that double means that you're not just going to get stuffed from 7 feet away. Mm-hmm. You know, that's what I mean.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And his goal, he said in this fight, was to keep. I think it sounds strange to keep a long range kicking game with Sergio Pettis. I guess he wanted to avoid his boxing, but that does seem strange. You would think you'd want to pressure Sergio a little bit.
I would think that you would just want to, and maybe maybe our read on this was a little bit wrong, but I would think that if you're gonna fight Sergio, you want to bang it out in the pocket with him, because you're gonna bet that you probably hit harder, you're maybe a little more durable. Even if he's craftier, that is strategically a fight that better suits you than one at long kicking range.
You're gonna give yourself the range to set up a quick takedown or hit a knockdown or something and create an opportunity to do what you do better than him.
Yeah, or even to outpace him, because Sergio is not a tremendously quick-paced fighter.
True. He faded in the third round against Maraga, and I think he has in a few 3-round fights. I think it's actually kind of a hard weight cut for him. We know he used to try.
Brutal.
He used to try 135. So, and he's getting bigger.
He in the fifth round against Moreno, he only threw like 35 strikes.
Yeah. Like, he slowed down before. He's getting broader and thicker as he gets a little older, and he already used to be a bantamweight. So. I would think pushing the pace and pressuring would be a great idea, especially in Mexico City, right? You'd think that would be your option. But it just felt like Moreno did not know how to, like, dictate a fight. Like he was trying to trick Sergio into letting him dictate the fight, but he wasn't dictating the fight. You know what I mean?
And that just doesn't work against a guy who's like for Pettis's flaws, which I think we've discussed a little bit, in addition to his strengths, which we've also discussed, like nobody is going to call Sergio Pettis a dumb fighter. No. He's a smart fighter and a crafty fighter, and one who at this point has a lot of experience, a lot of it against really good competition. Mm-hmm. Like or at least against very crafty competition that isn't going to let him get away with things. Mm-hmm. Like it's not like Sergio has fought killers. I mean, I'm looking back at his record and I'm thinking like, oh, this maybe wasn't as impressive a run as I thought it was. But what there are a lot of on this list are tough, crafty, durable journeymen, where you don't get to slip up and make big mistakes. Like guys like Chris Carriasso. Carriasso, kind of a joke as a title challenger, but a really good of mid-level flyweight. Maraga, same deal. Like not the world's greatest title challenger, but a really good, crafty, durable, mean fighter.
Yeah. He's the slightly bootlegged and undersized Ricardo Lamas. Like he's not a fighter that you would say it means nothing to beat him. Sonny beats John Maraga.
Even guys like Yautzin Mesa or Matt Hobart have a lot of depth of skill, and Sergio has gone the distance with those guys. So he's had a lot of opportunities and time to figure things out. So like you're not going to trick him. Even Chris Colates, like these are not dudes where you can just like fuck around and not have any idea what you're doing. So like Moreno trying to trick Pettis into fighting his fight was just not going to happen.
You're not going to taunt Sergio Pettis and say, maybe I'll give you so much control you'll shoot yourself in the foot with it. The way that Pettis has lost has been when he doesn't feel in control, when he's trying to come up with a way to solve the problem in front of him. When there's not enough time necessarily to like think clearly and be calm.
Yeah, or he just gets caught with something. Yeah, right. I mean, like which is how he's gotten caught.
Yeah,
make it crazy. It's something he didn't see coming. Right.
Sure.
Like so
making it crazy is better at least than waving your hand around and making faces. I did enjoy the faces, but they didn't lead to anything. Sergio is like a little tiny Conor McGregor at this point, and just letting him have the fight he wants is a terrible idea. That's why I still can't say he'll beat DJ or even Cejudo, but if somebody is going to let Sergio Pettis have his range, who at flyweight is a better striker than him? There's really no one.
Yeah, I mean, DJ. I think DJ could beat him in a pure striking matchup because I think DJ would pressure him really effectively.
Right, that's what I'm saying. But if, like, say, imagine Sergio, skill for skill, had a fight in which no one was pressuring or he's pressuring DJ, technically he's up there. He's among the very best in the division.
Maybe Joe Benavidez.
Maybe
and I still think in a kind of a pure striking matchup, that's still probably Sergio's fight to lose.
Sure, it takes some kind of pressure, some kind of scrappiness, something to get him out of his game. When he's on his game, he's pretty damn good. So let's take a break. Actually, when we come back, we have to get to Alexa Grasso in segment 2. We're also going to talk about Lomachenko and Miguel Mariaga's fight. And after that, in segment 3, listener questions from the heavy bag, all of that after this break. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show.
We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Pat, I'm going to let you take over this conversation to start with. You had a few thoughts on Alexa Grasso. She took a split decision, her second split decision in the UFC, against Ronda Marcos in the co-main event of this card. It was a catchweight bout because Grasso missed weight by 4 pounds, which isn't a great sign for her as a potential title contender. But you kind of had some thoughts on where she stands in the division and what she maybe needs to do to really fulfill her potential.
Yeah, so since she's come to the UFC, and this showed up in her first fight with Heather Jo Clark, right? As much as but it really popped up in her last fight with Herrig, and in this one against Ronda Marcos, it seems like since she has come over from Invicta, Grasso's coaches have tried to get her to take her foot off the gas a little bit and fight in a more measured fashion. Like they've had her standing at longer distance. She hasn't been pressuring as much. She hasn't been kind of bullying forward into the pocket the way that she did so effectively earlier in her career. She's effectively, it seems like they're trying to say, okay, you need to be more, I guess, more technical, or at the very least more measured. I think that's exact.
We have often complained about that, Pat. The idea that technical equals not throwing many strikes from a very long range. That's fighting technically.
We discussed this with Paige Van Zandt and Michelle Watterson and Paige Van Zandt versus Beck Rawlings at some length. And, like it's just not the case. So, but what they're trying to do, it seems like, is to turn her into some kind of platonic ideal of what a title contender striking first fighter looks like, as opposed to trying to make Alexa Grasso the best version of herself. Because what Grasso is really good at is fighting at a really quick pace, throwing a lot of combinations, getting into the pocket, working a lot of volume, and kind of bullying her opponent and beating her up. And she's a good clinch fighter too, so this plays into it. She doesn't really need to be that afraid as long as she's the one who's dictating where the fight takes place, especially when she pressures. Grasso is really, really, really dangerous because she's got all the space in the world to sprawl. She can stand her opponents up when they try to take her down, and then they're in the clinch with her, and you don't want to be in the clinch grinding it out with Alexa Grasso, really, if you can avoid it, because she's got more energy than you do. She's more dangerous with elbows and knees. Like, that's really her wheelhouse, is from the pocket into the clinch.
Yeah.
And outside that, she doesn't have a ton to offer. Inside that, you don't really want to be grappling either. Like, trying to turn her into an outfighter instead of a boxer puncher who likes to pressure just misses what makes her good in the first place.
Yeah, it's the difference is that she's now become this sort of outfighter, like a mediocre outfighter who does really impressive things in bursts. And what she should be doing is a really impressive, aggressive fighter who outfights in bursts. You know what I mean? Like, she'll be able to...
The Aaron Pryor model.
Right. She can fall back on the skill she has to box. It can be a thing that she uses to rest. It can be a thing she uses to reassess and reset. But if that's what you tell Alexa Grasso she should be doing all the time, it does seem like you end up with a lot of close fights in which she has to go back to what she does best in very small moments to even have an argument for winning. So let's give our listeners...
It just doesn't make sense.
Right.
It's really bothersome to me.
Let's give our listeners some evidence from this fight then. Like, what did you see from Grasso that showed what she's really good at? What were some impressive moments or some impressive techniques she used? And what were some things that made you think maybe she shouldn't be doing this? This style isn't really made for her.
When she was anytime she was standing at long distance throwing kicks, like when she was trying to throw the body kicks.
Just like against Herrig, man. Herrig scared her off of combination punching. She thought she had to be sharp and technical from long range, and so she just pattered away with these meaningless low kicks.
Yeah,
that did nothing.
I mean, she outlanded Herrig by 20 strikes in that fight.
And yet there was nobody really who was like, Grasso definitely won that fight. I thought the same thing when I was doing the research for this card. I saw on Fight Maker, I was like, how did she land 80 to Herrig 60? And then I remembered it's because she was throwing meaningless kicks and landing with her toes from long range while Herrig was busy landing the hardest punches of the fight.
Exactly. And that's like, so maybe it's not just Grasso's coaches, though I think her coaches are playing a big role in enabling this. Like, Grasso let herself get scared off by Herrig, and she kind of let herself get scared off in this fight a little bit by Marcos's takedown game in the second. When Grasso was in Marcos's face throwing, she was hurting her. Yeah. She was landing. Grasso is really dangerous when she's throwing more than one shot at a time. when Grasso is throwing one shot at a time, she doesn't really dig into them very hard. She doesn't really throw with a lot of pop. Her jab on its own it looks right, but it doesn't do everything it's supposed to unless she's moving forward or unless she's trying to sit down and dig into combinations. Like, I mean, so things that she did really well here, that when she went for that guillotine, let go of the guillotine and then hit the elbows, that's Grasso's brilliance. Yeah. Is in that space and that range. And when she hit a couple of times on exits, really nice combinations, like that's what Grasso does. She should be trying to manipulate the context of the fight to put herself in position to do that as often as possible. Like, when she's rolling, Grasso should be landing over the course of a 15-minute fight. She should be landing like 90 good strikes. Like, that's the kind of pace that she should work at, is an almost Ioane and Jacek pace. That's what she should be trying to do every time.
Yeah, I'm with you. Marcos definitely looked good in this fight. She was clearly in very good shape. I think she's making very small improvements. I don't think she's ever going to quite fulfill that potential that some people thought she had when she got upset wins on The Ultimate Fighter. But she looked good. Her conditioning was good. She hit some nice takedowns. She had the right idea, I think, for winning this fight and did what she could. The thing is that Grasso, I think, made the fight a little more difficult on herself than it had to be. In fact, you could say that the stuff she tries to do from long range, this ineffective, too patient, timid sort of kickboxing she falls back on when her opponent is comfortable enough in the pocket, it actively made it harder for her to win this fight, because I think Marcos hit 2 of her takedowns off of caught kicks. It was definitely the kind of fight in which you'd think Grasso should get into mid-range and let her hands fly. And she didn't do that often enough to win this comfortably. And I think that's why we ended up with a split decision. I think if Grasso had been in control a little more, maybe pressured Marcos a bit, or at least stood at mid-range and threw punches at her more than 2 or 3 at a time, then she would have probably won an easier decision. She would have kept the fight and possibly would have finished Marcos, because Marcos was definitely there to be hit when Grasso did let her hands go. And it was likewise in the fight with Herrig. It wasn't until round 3, but when Grasso threw combinations, when she used her jab to set up punches, head, body, hooks, straights, all kinds of stuff, she did really well. But she doesn't.
The best analog for Grasso's game is Tomas Almeida. That's when she is doing what she should be doing. She fights a lot like Almeida does when he's doing well, and they share in interesting ways kind of the same issues, that they're not really fast starters. Like, it takes them a minute or two to kind of get into the rhythm of things, which makes them a little bit vulnerable. They don't have impenetrable takedown defense. They're vulnerable to getting taken down. They occasionally get in their own heads about what it is they're supposed to be doing and try to do things that are not to their best advantage. And like Almeida, when he has looked not as impressive, it's been when he's tried to be something he's not. And Grasso, I think very similarly, is at her worst when she's trying to be something that she's not. So like, there's a lesson here, which is there is not a platonic ideal of the best fighter. There's the best version of themselves that a particular fighter can be, and when you pursue that, you're going to be the best fighter.
Yeah, and even when we break it down, into styles to more understand maybe what styles are. Basically, in some sense, specializations. They are a specialist is a stylist, someone who knows what they're good at, and that's how they fight. And could you really say, like, who's a better pressure fighter, Henry Armstrong or Julio Cesar Chavez? I might say Armstrong, but okay, who's a better pressure fighter? Dwight Muhammad Qawi or, I don't know, Joe Frazier? I don't know. Some of these are clearly better than the others, but the idea is, even within a style, even within a specialization, there's not going to be a platonic ideal. There's not the perfect pressure fighter. It doesn't exist. The style is going to have to be crafted for what the fighter is good at, what they feel comfortable doing, and even what sort of creative new things they want to try down the road. And I think it seems like if Grasso, maybe if her defense was improved, maybe if she was trained more like that style of fighter, she needs something to be able to keep her style of fight. She needs something to be able to force that on her opponents, because whether it's because of training or because she gets scared out of her strategy too easily, she spends far too much time fighting against type. and it hampers her. It really does hamper her. So it was a fun fight. I mean, it was definitely a fun fight, and the flashes of brilliance just ultimately end up making it a little frustrating because we know that Grasso probably could have won this fight a little more easily. But as in the case of Sergio Pettis, very young, 23 years old. She's got lots of time. Maybe she'll be jumping around camps in the future. Maybe she'll take a few more hard losses or a few more close fights before she turns that corner. Or maybe she never does. We'll see. Let's go ahead and move on to Vasyl Lomachenko, whose mother is extremely heavy, as we covered at the start of the show, at least according to a mysterious figure known as Miguel M. Maraga had a puncher's chance. That's what he was given going into this fight. The puncher's chance always exists. Who was it? Man, there's a great quote out there. Runyon, maybe the guy's name. He said, where human beings are conserved, no one is 3-1 over another. There's always a puncher's chance. But, boy, does Vasyl Lomachenko make it look like that chance is 0. He really, really, like, if you go into a fight with Lomachenko and people are saying, well, maybe he'll land the big shot, you're dead. You're going to get killed. Like, you're not going to land the big shot on Lomachenko. Because even if you land a big shot, it's not going to be the one. The fight's always still his. Just another mind-blowingly masterful, symphonic performance of boxing skill from Lomachenko. Crazy stuff.
He is on another plane of existence. It's the only way that I can think of to describe him. Because he can do everything, but this is another thing that we just talked about with, like, knowing yourself as a fighter. Lomachenko seems to know that what he really likes to do and what he wants to embrace is kind of bullying his opponent with how much better he is than them. Mm-hmm. Like, because Lomachenko could, if he wanted to, sit back and be maybe the best outfighter in boxing.
He has the second best strike defense, punch defense in boxing right now, behind Guillermo Rigondeaux. And he lands about 2 or 3 times as many more punches. Like, his defense it cannot be overstated how good it is.
If he wanted to, he could just sit back and stick and move all fight and fight 12 and win easy 11-1 or 12-0 decisions. Yeah. If he wanted to. That's what he could do. But that's not what Lomachenko wants to do. Mm-hmm. And I think Lomachenko and like, if he fought kind of against his, like, he has the skills to do that. So if he wanted to, he could do that. But he doesn't want to. And he's a better fighter for not taking what is probably the lowest risk path for him. Mm-hmm. He's a better fighter for it because this is what allows him to get guys out of there. Like, there's a chance, no matter how small that chance is, that a headbutt or a lucky shot or a low blow that the ref didn't see or something like that could put Lomachenko in trouble had that fight gone another 5 rounds of him just sticking and moving and doing and kind of just scoring points for the sake of scoring points. Mm-hmm. Like, by getting him out of there and by getting the other guys that he's gotten out of there, by embarrassing Nicholas Walter, who's not a fighter that you really embarrass, mm-hmm. like, by doing that kind of thing, by getting in their face and showing just his quality over and over and over again, Lomachenko is embracing who he is. He's putting on a show. He's making himself more popular and making himself more money. And I think also perversely is lessening the risk of something random and bad happening to him.
Yes.
Like, I think it is actually a safer way as a strategic gambit for him to fight than sticking and moving and fighting quote unquote safe.
I'm so glad you said that. It's career strategy. When this fight started, was Teddy Atlas in commentary? I thought I heard a crazed man saying something about this fight. Maybe it was Teddy Atlas.
That was Teddy Atlas.
Yes,
it was crazed.
He's my favorite crazed man, by the way, in the world of boxing. But Teddy Atlas said, like, first thing, and when this fight started, he said, Lomachenko changes the way his opponents fight. Because Maraga usually comes in aggressive, throwing punches. He might have thrown, I think Teddy said, like 10 or 15 hard punches by now, and he hasn't thrown one. And it's because Lomachenko makes you think there's no puncher's chance. Lomachenko gives you the targets he wants you to have. He puts just the right amount of pressure so you throw when he wants you to throw. He is so rarely surprised by what his opponent does. And it is not as if no one could beat Lomachenko. In this fight, I mean, Mariaga's a hard puncher, and he landed some devastating shots to Lomachenko's body. in the early going in this fight that basically went ignored by commentary and fans, and seemingly by Lomachenko. Basically went ignored because Maraga could not turn those immediately into headshots. But it's not like he couldn't hit Lomachenko. Lomachenko was close enough. He was putting the pressure on him, and I think the body, just as it was in the Salido fight, and the groin, if we're being honest, are going to be viable targets for everyone. That probably Lomachenko's extremely hard to hit to the head, but maybe about 70% is hard to hit to the body, which is often the case, because it just doesn't move as easily. You can't just shift a hip and move your whole torso out of the way. It's a target for everyone. And yet, because of the career strategy of, like, having fought all of his fights, having conducted himself in such a way that everyone looks like they are 13 levels below him in terms of boxing skill, that he's like a coral belt in boxing and everyone else is a white belt, to use jiu-jitsu terminology, punchers come into fights with Lomachenko and don't punch. And they don't put their punches together, and they don't see the openings created by the few things they do that are effective. Lomachenko has conducted his professional career in such a way that pro boxers don't think they can beat him. He has an aura different from, very different color, very different sort of glow to it, but similar in effect to what Mike Tyson had when he was fighting at his prime. People were scared to fight Mike Tyson, and maybe they're scared more of being embarrassed than they are of being badly hurt against Lomachenko. Like Tyson, they thought would kill them, but people are timid when they fight Vasyl Lomachenko. They don't fight the way that they are best at. Lomachenko is a specialist whose specialty is making everyone else's specialty go away, like turning everyone else into a non-specialist. Everyone looks pedestrian against him, like they don't have a strategy, they don't have a style. Lomachenko's is the only style that exists in the ring when he's in the ring. It's just pretty crazy, the level of control. I could gush about it for a long time, but I mean, what do you think about that? Did you notice anything that Maraga could have capitalized on more? Did you pick up on some of those early body shots? He landed a good right hand, changing his timing as Lomachenko came in. Like, there are opportunities, but it never felt close. It never felt like Lomachenko was ever in trouble.
Yeah, that's the thing, is when you fight Lomachenko, there are opportunities. The question is whether you can take advantage of them or not. So I thought that what you mentioned about the body shots was really good, because he landed some really good ones. Mm-hmm. What those body shots didn't do was change anything about Lomachenko's approach to the fight.
Nothing
they
discernible.
Didn't put Lomachenko off anything.
Yeah.
Which is the difference between what Lomachenko does to you and what you do back to Lomachenko. You can't teach Lomachenko lessons the way that Lomachenko teaches you lessons. So the way this played out to me was Maraga did a good job of landing those body shots, especially as Lomachenko pressured him. Lomachenko just kept right on pressuring him and walked through the body shots. And when Lomachenko had Maraga backed up to the ropes, there were opportunities there. Lomachenko was doing something that I thought was really interesting. He would square his stance and kind of go to town with both hands in really weird ways and just touch and touch and touch and touch and touch. And eventually Maraga would get flustered and move. But because he had so flustered Maraga by taking those body shots and walking right through and continuing to pressure him, Maraga missed the obvious opportunities to unload shots on a Lomachenko who wasn't in the best position to defend them. Like, he was so out of his head with what Lomachenko was doing to him that he didn't see the obvious chance to punch across the plane of Lomachenko's body and hit him. Like, I guess because he figured that Lomachenko had to be baiting him, and Lomachenko probably was baiting him. But even if he was baiting him, there was still a chance. But Maraga could not bring himself to take advantage of it. It was so wild to me to watch that.
Yeah, it's like the thing you want is a candy bar, and Lomachenko literally puts a candy bar between your teeth and your open mouth, and you're like, boy, if I try to bite down, something bad's going to happen. Like,
yeah, and you manage to think that, like, whatever is going to come back is going to be so bad that I don't really want that candy bar. I don't want it.
Maraga's undeniably the harder single puncher of these two. But the way this fight began and the way it played out, Maraga was the one who looked like he was terrified of what might happen if he missed.
You know what this reminds me of?
What's that?
Is the scene in – you've seen Dodgeball, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the scene where Ben Stiller is in his office, like, talking himself out of eating
pizza.
He's like rubbing the pizza. He's rubbing the pizza on his crotch, and that's basically what Lomachenko is doing with opportunities to hit him. He's just rubbing pizza all over his opponent's genitals, and the opponent is like, no, I don't want it. I don't want it.
I think maybe what he does, he rubs your knuckles all over his chin. It's like, please punch it. And you're like,
I'm sticking with pizza and genitals, but you can go with knuckles and chin if you want. Like, I prefer mine.
Yeah, that's all right. We'll let you, to each his own. Yeah, I guess what it comes down to is Lomachenko teaches you things about how fighting works when you watch him. And I think what he taught me in this fight and a few of his others that it's kind of crystallizing now is that style, like what makes an effective style is the marriage between what you're comfortable doing and how you can dictate what happens in the fight. It is initiative and comfort at their perfect median. And so if you're an outfighter, the way you're going to maintain initiative is by forcing the other guy to chase you. You're going to use feints, you're going to use your jab, you're going to keep him jumpy, you're going to be in control and make him chase you without ever feeling like he's being successful. And if you're a pressure fighter, you are going to chase that guy down and cut him off so thoroughly that he is always going to be reacting to what you're doing to him. He's always going to be trying to move away, trying to get away, trying not to get hit, maybe trying to hit you back, but everything's going to be in response to you. And Lomachenko seems so flexible in the ring, but he's always comfortable, and he's always got the initiative. Everyone's always worried about what he's going to do. And there was no clearer... The career strategy idea really hits home in the way that people who are good fighters step into the ring with Lomachenko, and instantly they are not fighting like themselves. Because they're already, even before he's shown them anything in the fight, they're already worried about what he's going to do next. And it's pretty astounding to see that done to experienced professionals. So Lomachenko continues to astound, continues to impress us, and continues to rub slices of delicious cheese pizza all over his crotch. When we come back, we are going to talk about some questions from our listeners. We've got some of our subscribers, our patrons on Patreon, have submitted heavy bag questions, and we've got some solid ones. So we are going to answer those after this break.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
And we are back. Welcome back to Heavy Hands. I'm Connor. Pat is with me. We've got heavy bag questions. Let's hear that sound effect. And our first question comes to us from a patron by the mysterious name of N. N asks, if you had to pick a ratio on how much a fighter should train in different arts, what would the ratio be? Say you had 10 hours of training time. How much would you spend on grappling, wrestling, striking, and MMA overall? How would you divide up your 10 hours in a day to train? What do you say, Pat?
That's a really good question because I think it gets at the heart of the current metagame shifts in MMA. So for a long time, we were told that you needed to be able to do everything and that the best fighters were going to be the ones who could fight like a wrestler against a boxer or a jiu-jitsu specialist against a wrestler or, whatever, that you were basically playing whack-a-mole with your opponent's skill sets. So whatever they were good at, you were going to do the opposite of that. And you were going to be, and by virtue of your well-roundedness, you were going to win fights that way.
And I think we've now learned that whereas anyone can indeed make the shape of a rock, a paper, or a pair of scissors, not everyone can change styles that easily to counter their opponent.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, what we've seen is that you need to have, if you're going to succeed at the very highest levels, a skill set that wins out against everybody. Yeah. You need to be able to have something that you can fall back on that's going to be better than what your opponents can do. You still need to know how to wrestle. If you're going to be an elite level striker, you still need to know how to wrestle defensively. It helps you if you can hit a takedown every once in a while. You need to know how to grapple. You need to know how to grapple offensively and defensively. But you should be spending most of your time trying to figure out how strategically and skill-wise to enforce your primary skill set, that thing that you're going to do better than everybody else. And I think that should be reflected in your training time. Like, if you want to be a smothering wrestle grappler, then you should be spending most of your training time on that, and you should be spending your striking training time figuring out what it is about your striking skill sets that are going to lead into what you do best.
Yeah, I agree. It should really be about, like, what's your goal in training these different arts? You are not going to be a successful fighter just by going into the gym and learning to throw 1,000 different striking techniques and do 200 different submissions and 24 different takedowns. That's not going to make you a fighter unless you learn to winnow down what really works best for you. Why are you throwing these particular techniques? Once again, it comes down to training strategy versus training tactics. You choose the tactics of your training. You choose what to do at each time based on why those things make sense. And I think the other thing is that you're not going to be a fighter who, hold on, let me think of how to phrase this, who says, like, okay, I need to be able to wrestle, I need to be able to grapple, so I'm going to spend 2/3 of my time shooting takedowns and taking the back and working on rides. You can learn those skill sets. Like, you are going to need to know all those skills. Like you said, you need to be able to wrestle, you need to be able to grapple, but you can also, like, you can make your style work by just stymieing what other people want to do too. If you have your specialty, you're an amazing striker. Say you are Jose Aldo. You're an amazing striker. How much time does Jose Aldo spend in the UFC grappling or wrestling with his opponents? No one would say he was not a phenomenally skilled grappler nor a phenomenally skilled wrestler. He was very good at both of those things. But that was reflected in his style of fighting. You did not see Jose Aldo going out there and shooting takedowns unless he really had to. You did not see Jose Aldo going out there and throwing up arm bars or trying to counter a shot with a guillotine. Jose Aldo knew that he was a specialist, and I imagine his training reflected the ways in which he would need to use those other skill sets to strengthen his specialty. I bet you Jose Aldo trained a lot more takedown defense than he did double leg takedowns. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and Jose Aldo was still a phenomenally talented offensive takedown artist, but that's not what he spent his time training to do.
Yeah.
And I remember Andre Pedneris talking about, and I think he told this to Brian Stan, and Brian Stan repeated the anecdote that, like, basically Pedneris would just have members of the Brazilian national wrestling team come in and try to wrestle Jose Aldo to the ground.
I remember Stan saying that. He said they only the very best guys could get him down when he was tired by the time he was done.
Yeah. So it's not like he was in there drilling Olympic-style wrestling with those guys. Yeah. It's that they were trying to take him down. That's what he drilled, and he drilled it incredibly well. And I would guess, without having, like, inside knowledge of what Robbie Lawler's training practices look like, I would guess that most of his wrestling training was focused on guys trying to take him down and not just, like, free-form wrestling practices.
Yeah. Because
Robbie Lawler was a striker who wanted to be standing, and he needed to know how to defend takedowns to do that. Like, that was, I mean, it's, and I would guess Joanna Jędrzejczyk too. I would get Joanna Jędrzejczyk does drill her own takedowns, but I would guess she spends far more of her time drilling how to defend them.
Yeah, and I've seen her shoot once, and I'm sure she does plenty of scrambling and drilling of all the techniques she might need. But again, we're talking about ratios here, right? We're talking about how much time you invest in a certain type of training. So say you are a striker, you might invest half of your time in polishing and refining your striking skills in the strategic use that they are made for. If you're an outfighter, you're going to practice your outfighting most of the time you do your striking. Maybe 20% of the time you'll try other things just to play around and be loose. And maybe you'll do those things like in light sparring even, just to kind of try out new things and see if a new avenue opens up for you stylistically. But the other half of the time, you're not just going to want, I imagine anyway, maybe we can ask some coaches this question in the future, because it is an interesting one for people actually developing fighters. But I imagine Joanna Jędrzejczyk's not going to spend all of that time just wrestling. Although it is funny that when we talk about, like, you know how there's all these little rules where people say, like, oh, you can't do this in MMA because this. You can't slip because head kick. You can't duck because uppercut. You can't jab because counter flying knee. You know, like all of these improbable scenarios. One of the funny ones that used to come up, I would talk to people back in my Sherdog days even about boxing technique and everything, and people would be like, well, how do you defend a takedown from this stance? How do you do this from this stance? Like, you're going to have to change everything about your striking game if you're a striker to develop it for MMA. And it's funny that if you really just think about it, the answer to, if we looked at Jose Aldo, the kickboxer, and said, how is he going to learn to do this in MMA? The solution really is learn to wrestle, learn to grapple, but learn to do those things in a way that augments what you do best. So thank you, N, for your question. And we have one more question here. I'm not going to play that sound effect again. This one is from, hold on, Jacob on. Jacob, thank you for your question. Thank you again, N, as well. As a shorter man, Jacob asks, I resort to walking forward on my sparring partners a lot. I find success when I come forward at angles, for example, switching to southpaw to hit an angle on their weak left side. But when I'm in front of them, they stick me with jabs and lace me with push kicks and side kicks to keep me at bay. How would you suggest he deals with that? What are the tactics that you could convey via podcast to somebody trying to fight bigger men in sparring?
So I think the big thing is to counter.
Yeah.
When you're coming forward, because you are going to have to come forward. You can't just get stuck on the end of their reach. You're going to have to shrink the distance between the two of you. One of the two of you is going to need to do that, and it's more than likely going to need to be you. But so when they try to stick you with jabs and push kicks and side kicks and the like, you need to have tools in place to counter them. Somebody tries to push kick you, you can grab their leg, and there are a variety of counters that you can hit off of a caught push kick. If somebody tries to throw a side kick at you, I think either get around to the side of it, or my favorite thing to do is to kick them, is to kick the leg when somebody tries to side kick you, because they're putting all of their weight on that leg and pushing off of it. So if you can counter that side kick, it's tremendously painful. And because of the way they've got that leg planted, you're much more likely to be able to land a kick right into the meat of their hamstring. It's really, really painful to get leg kicked while you're throwing a side kick. So the way to do that, I think, is to practice moving forward into your counters, not planting your feet to counter, but stepping forward into them.
And I think it's great practice to try and be able to do everything you do. Like in shadow boxing, it's a great time to practice throwing your punches, using your slips and parries and rolls and everything while moving your feet. And if you're a shorter guy...
Adjustment steps.
Exactly.
Always adjustment steps.
You want to keep your feet squarely under your body in as close to their fundamental position as they can be, no matter what you're doing. And learning to do that with these little adjustment steps is a big way to make yourself a more effective pressure fighter in particular. Because as a pressure fighter, you're going to want to be moving forward and attacking, or moving forward as you defend. You're going to want to be using every opportunity you have to use a technique to also close distance. So it's good to be able to do all those things at once.
So this is something like John Lineker and Jessica Andrade have generally done pretty well. Not so much in either of their most recent fights, but in general, I think they've both done this really well, is follow the shots back. As shorter fighters, you've got to follow your opponent's shots back to the source. You can't just, it's not enough to say, okay, I'm going to counter. So when they throw at you, you're going to try and just plant your feet and throw back, because as the shorter person, all those shots are going to come up short anyway.
Right.
What you have to do is keep moving into the shot. You need to, and that's going to take some of the sting off their shots too. If you're not getting caught right at the end of the shot, but it's somewhere closer to the beginning of the arc, it's going to hurt a lot less. It's going to do a lot less damage to you. So you have to just practice over and over and over again, moving into the shots. So as you're shadow boxing, like Connor said, practice throwing as you move, practice moving your feet.
Advance across from corner to corner, cover the whole ring while throwing 10 punches or doing 10 slips, or use a slip line. Slip lines are great for this. When you tie a line from the top of rope of the ring to the top rope on the other side, and just dodge and roll and throw punches around it as you move forward or backward. Those are essential. One thing I would say that I would add is to embrace the mindset of an outfighter. Even if you're a pressure fighter, as I consider myself to be, like you, Jacob, most of my sparring partners, especially the good ones, are a lot bigger than me, a lot longer and a lot taller. I don't think I'm super short at like 5'11 and a half, but for my weight, I'm definitely not as tall as some of these like 6'4" guys that I see in the gym sometimes. And the solution for me has been, because I've run into the same problem as you. I've done this thing where I just feel like I'm coming forward and just running into something every time. And I try to do angles, but it takes a lot of energy. And I'm like, why am I just running into the same shit over and over? And the reason is because I keep thinking that I have to keep moving forward, and I have to do it right now, and I have to do it all the time. And the truth is that I can also be too far away to be hit. I can also make him reach for me. I can try to make him use his reach. And that's my window to get onto the inside and start my pressuring flurry. That's my chance to basically, when that jab comes out or that side kick comes out, I'm so far away that I either can't be hit or I can move to the side and I have plenty of time to evade. And at that point, I ride that long strike right back into the pocket. I follow that jab back home with punches. It's a lot easier when you realize that you can be on the edge of range and make them miss and choose the right opportunity to bridge that gap. You just don't have to be the one leading all the time. I guess that ties into what you were saying, Pat, about learning to counter. But you don't have to be in there forcing the fight by just throwing punches constantly. That's when you run into shit. You make them throw, and then you have a bridge. So that would be my advice, and Pat's advice as well. And thank you, Jacob. Thank you, N, for your questions. And thank you, everybody who listened in today. We hope you enjoyed the show. Sergio Pettis, Vasyl Lomachenko. I did want to say, because I've been watching a lot of this guy's fights lately, if you want to learn more about being a short guy getting inside, watch some Dwight Muhammad Qawi, a.k.a. Dwight Braxton. Watch his fight with Matthew Saad Muhammad. Watch his fight with Leon Spinks. Watch all of his fights, because he's extremely fun and usually just beats the ass off of people with a grin on his face. But he was like a 5'6.5", 5'7" as a light heavyweight and a cruiserweight. And I think even maybe a few times as a heavyweight. I think he fought Evander Holyfield at heavyweight and was tiny, like smaller than me, and I'm not that big for big dudes. And was a remarkably good defensive fighter and a great pressure fighter. And you can kind of study him, watch him, and figure out how it works. Other than that, Pat, what about you this week? What do you have coming out before we wrap things up?
I have a brand new episode of Tides of History coming out this week, looking at the Eastern Roman Empire in the 5th century, why it stuck around while the western half of the Roman Empire fell. And then I've got another episode on that topic coming out next week. Sitting down tomorrow, I'm very excited. The day this episode comes out, I'm sitting down to record an interview with Mike Duncan, who did the History of Rome podcast and currently does the Revolutions podcast. We're gonna have ourselves a little chat. He wrote a book that comes out in a couple of months. I'm reading it now. It's awesome. I highly recommend it. It's called The Storm Before the Storm. But yeah, no, we're gonna have ourselves a little chat. I'm very much looking forward to it. He's a sharp guy.
The Storm Before the Storm. What a title.
Yeah, it's pretty dang good one. I think they hit on something good.
That's a good title. I mean, I'm a man who loves his titles, and that's a solid one. What is the schedule? Just so people listening to this know, what's the release schedule for episodes? Because I kept trying to refresh mine, and it seems like you take a week off.
Yeah, so I do. There are 3 episodes a month, basically. There are 2 big substantive episodes and then an interview.
Okay.
Basically I'll do 2 episodes on a linked topic. Like, this one is the Eastern Roman Empire. The next one I'm doing is the military revolution in the early modern period. So I'll have one episode where we kind of go over the big the big topics, the big narratives in that particular thing, and then one that tries to personalize it more and bring it down to like real people. So that's basically the schedule, and then one interview that we'll stick in. I'm not sure that there's going to be an interview every month, but pretty much every month you'll get one with a historian or somebody who's interested in the topics.
Sounds awesome, man. You going to shout out some Varangian Guard while you're talking about the Eastern Roman Empire?
No, we're not getting that far. This is only doing the 5th century. The Varangian Guard you got to get a little bit later.
5th century. Come on, Pat. Harold Hardrada. Get to business, all right?
You can do your own history podcast on the 11th century, and you can talk about whatever you want.
Vikings who visited the Mediterranean. That's my whole topic. That sounds awesome, man. Yeah, so keep an eye out for Pat's upcoming Tides of History episodes. If you, like me, were slightly confused when you refreshed your podcast app this last week and there was no episode, now you know why. As for me, I'm still working on this Technique Speakeasy video. That's what I'm calling this new series. I'm going to try to make this a regular thing. I'm going to, instead of doing as many articles, which kind of lack some of the immediacy, I might be able to put my points a lot more succinctly and not ramble on so much when I write an article, but the immediacy of like, here's a technique I'm excited about, here's a cool exchange I saw, here's an idea I want to get across, that isn't there with this UFC schedule. There's just not enough time to turn all of those ideas into articles. So I'm doing a video series called Technique Speakeasy, and by the time this episode comes out, you should have seen the first episode. Look back at UFC 214, maybe a couple of other fights, and just gave basically a quick rundown of why those fights played out the way they did and what techniques and exchanges caught my eye. So keep an eye out for that. I think that's about it. We don't have another UFC event for a while. Not till August, 30-something? Not till the end of the month. So we're going to have a few weeks here in the lead up to Mayweather-McGregor. We're going to try to bring in a few interesting people to talk to. We are going to try to cover some more of our patrons' questions because with this schedule, it's been so hard to get to you guys' questions. We do appreciate your patience. And if you haven't submitted one in a while, send us a new question. The best way is to send us a message on Patreon. Of course, we do prefer patrons' questions first. We only really tend to go to non-patron questions when we got none left. So if you're a patron and you haven't had a question answered at that $5 level, send us your questions on Patreon. And other than that, that's about it. Find us on social media. Ask us your questions, comments, concerns, praise. We both love praise. Pat is at Patrick_Wyman. I am at Boxing Bush, BUSCH. You can find my other work on BloodyElbow.com and SureDog.com. You can find Pat's stuff besides his podcast on Deadspin.com. And we will catch you guys next week. If you came here this week for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.